You've been thinking about launching a podcast, and it's a great way to promote your business. But where do you start? You have so many questions. What equipment do you need? How long should an episode be? How do you get listed on Spotify? About Basingstoke is the answer. We're professional audio producers with decades of experience. We can advise you on your podcasting strategy, record your episodes, or show you how to do it yourself, get you listed on all the major platforms, and help you understand audience building and ways to turn listeners into leads. Find out more at aboutbasingstoke.com/podcasts. Oh, and if you think you have to do video because who listens to audio these days? Well, you're listening to this, aren't you? Get professional podcast advice and production. Visit aboutbasingstoke.com/podcasts.
A huge thank you to our sponsors at InQ Hive. They're now open at Howe Mills, Basingstoke, with everything for freelancers, small and growing businesses, from virtual office and postbox services, hot desks, dedicated desks and serviced offices, plus amazing business support. Find out more at inqhive.co.uk.
I'm Felicity Dwyer. I'm a facilitator, trainer and coach. I've worked in management development for over 20 years. I'm also the author of Crafting Connection, Transform How You Communicate with Yourself and Others.
Well, Felicity, welcome. Now, communication is such a big thing. It's vital for getting the message across, bringing people together, getting good engagement, making people feel connected, happy, engaged in their work. But it's not always something that bosses, people who own businesses, even those who would call themselves leaders, are necessarily good at.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes, particularly when people first move into a management role and, there's so many things going on, they've got to get things done through people. And sometimes the focus is so much on the getting things done that they forget that the way you do that is through people, through engaging with people, through building those relationships, not only one-to-one with people you're managing, but within the wider team. If you're leading a team of people, you need to also keep an eye on how they relate to each other. And if you can get all that right, then you've got a really good chance of getting a high-performing and motivated team.
And we've got two almost distinct audiences. There's those who are business owners, and they have come into this through wanting to run their own business, and the business has grown, which is brilliant, and they have to take on staff and more staff and more staff, and they get bigger and bigger, and that's a challenge. But then there's also those who are in corporate settings, for example, or are those managers in those businesses we're talking about who get promoted and find themselves in leadership positions. And often there's not enough training along the way, or any training sometimes along the way, on that communication piece.
Absolutely. One of the things I do is run training courses, and I'll work with somebody maybe from an organisation, so on the corporate side, who's perhaps been managing for a couple of years and has never had any training. And to be honest with you, it's not rocket science. But there's a few simple things that you can do. So whether you've been promoted as a manager or whether you're a business owner and suddenly it's not just you've got to get things done through people. There's a few simple things that can help make that transition a bit easier and help you get it right. So I would recommend getting a bit of training, sooner rather than later, just to set you off on the right path.
And give us a couple of those simple things then, Felicity.
There's a few things, really. Some of them are more obvious than others. Firstly, you actually need to be really clear if you're working with a team, if you're managing a team, about what you expect from people. So what's the purpose of their role, but also how does that fit into the wider team? So what are the priorities? What are the standards you're expecting? So that may seem quite obvious, but it's really important. Don't assume people know things. Have those conversations. So it's partly clarifying what you want, but it's also really equipping people to deliver for you. And I think one of the roles you play as a manager or a team leader or a business owner who's now bringing people into the business is that of a coach or a trainer, in just helping people really, learn to grow, understand what interests people and help them to develop those interests, in the context of their job. So I think there's a real key part of management, which is about helping people learn. And alongside that, I think there's the need to understand, where people are at. So if somebody's new to a business, they might need, a fair amount of information and guidance. But as they get more confident in their role, you need to know when to step back a bit. And certainly the two things that I find people complain about, if you like, in a manager is either not getting enough support and also being micromanaged. So they're sort of two sides of the same coin. So there's a real skill in knowing when someone needs a bit more support and also when to back off and, let people fly, if you like.
And I think there's a fair bit of sort of superficiality, if that's a word, in the way that certainly when people are first getting to know each other in business, they use certain things that are just kind of almost crutches that are there. So, for example, in the interview situation, somebody might be talking in a way that they've been perhaps trained or just think that they should talk to get the job without really discussing, how they are and how they need to be managed. And then at the other side, managers often fall into sort of corporate speak and key phrases that sound like they might mean something, but actually when you dig down, it's not really telling you anything.
Absolutely. And it all comes down, Steve, doesn't it, to that human connection, talking to people as people, what do you enjoy doing? What are your ambitions? What interests you? How can I be a better manager? How can I support you better? I mean, something that's really useful is for managers to ask for feedback, but to speak to your corporate speak point, saying, oh, can you give me some feedback? That doesn't usually result in some very honest feedback, but asking for, just something positive, how can I support you better? Is there anything more you'd like from me as your manager? So almost inviting people not to criticize you, but to phrase something in the positive. I think that can be a lot more productive than using words like feedback, which I think is a bit overused.
Now, you've used the word support, and I think that's a good word. That's a positive word. Everybody likes to feel supported. There may be some managers who think, well, I'm here to run a business. I'm here to manage a team. Have I really got the capacity to support people? That sounds like a big deal. But, speak to us about how important that support is and how that looks in an organization.
Yes. Firstly, I think it's reminding yourself when you are in a management role that part of your job, and you've probably got other tasks which aren't directly related to your people management, but part of your job is to get things done through people. And if you are not prioritizing your support of individuals, people will pick up on that. You do need to make it priorities. That's the first thing. Recognize it is not like a side part of your job. It is a core part of your job. And the easiest way to do it is having simple structures in place. So a one-to-one meeting, maybe monthly, whatever sort of works for your business, that can be really helpful because they don't have to be long meetings, but it's the fact that it's in your diary. It's the place where you can have that conversation, how did it go last month? What did you achieve last month? Is there anything that, you need to learn next month? What didn't go so well? What do you need to do to improve? So to have those conversations scheduled, I think it's important. And sometimes you do find that people, either they don't do it, I'm surprised a number of organisations don't include one-to-ones, or they kind of get cancelled or they don't seem to be a priority. So I think you really need to recognise that actually putting in a little bit of structured time on a regular basis can potentially save you a lot of time in the long run if things actually start to go wrong and either an employee is really underperforming and then you've got a whole load of problems there, or people just don't feel that sort of level of support. So I think it's sometimes just having those structures and recognizing that this is liable to stop you getting problems later on. So I think that's really important. So that's about the individuals. The other thing that I think is really important if you're working with a team is to have effective team meetings. So that's the other aspect, so that people, understand what their colleagues are working on, that you can sort of solve any potential conflicts between team members, because that does happen, at a relatively early stage. So it's the one-to-one meetings and the team meetings, and they're not nice to haves in my opinion. They are really essential to providing that support structure.
And I guess the tone is really important, whether it's those one-to-one meetings or whether it's a team meeting. It shouldn't be, I'm the boss, tell me what you've done, why haven't you done better? It should be, to use a part of your work, they should be a facilitator, shouldn't they, of opening up the conversation. What have you achieved? How would you have liked to, so almost putting it back onto them so that they feel they've got ownership of it. What would you like to achieve next month and how can I help you do that?
Absolutely. I love that you've used that word facilitator and also the positive framing. I think both those things are really powerful. And in fact, to motivate people, there has been some research about this. People should be receiving much more. Some people say 5 times as many. Some people say a different number. But people should be receiving more positive feedback or having more opportunities to reflect on success than, saying, oh, this could be improved, which does not mean that if things aren't up to scratch, you don't raise it. In fact, you should raise it, in my opinion, in quite a direct and honest way. However, if people feel they only get feedback when something's gone wrong, or if you're not engaging people, you're just telling rather than asking, then, that can be quite demotivating. So, positive feedback. And positive feedback isn't just saying, well done. It's noticing things people did particularly well. So if someone, for example, dealt with a difficult customer with empathy and they calm down and you observe that, then you can just give a quick piece of feedback on that. Oh, I noticed that, you dealt with that situation really well and you showed that you understood. It's that showing that you've noticed. And, you don't do it day in and day out, but you do need to do it regularly. If people aren't getting 1 or 2 pieces of positive feedback a week, which, doesn't sound like much, but I think a lot of people aren't getting this, then I think people can start to feel, is my good work being noticed or not? And I think on that positive feedback, some people do need feedback more than others. And sometimes if you're a manager and you're quite, and this may be true of a lot of entrepreneurs, you're quite internally referenced, you've done a good job, you don't need so much feedback. You may not recognise that some people really do need it and thrive on it. And it's a simple tip, but just ask yourself, am I giving people enough feedback? So not only do I have good structure, but am I giving people feedback? Am I noticing them as individuals?
I think that's really key, that thing of people needing feedback, because we hear a lot in business about imposter syndrome. And yes, it's something that's often attributed to entrepreneurs, for example, but people at every level can have that. And sometimes it is just that simple thing of a manager saying, oh, you're doing that absolutely brilliantly, or you did that well, you handled that well. That just helps with that whole thing of, am I good at this? Am I doing the right thing? Yeah. And it makes such a difference.
Yeah, it really does. And that point you raised about asking somebody, what do you think went well? I mean, that's really good thing to ask, because then that will highlight, okay, oh, right, they haven't noticed that they do this well. So then you can fill in the gaps. And it's the same when performance has slipped a bit, what could you do next time? If you see that someone hasn't identified the issue, you can raise it, you can give your ideas. But, it's much more powerful when people identify changes for themselves than just being told all the time. We all like to come up with our own solutions, and that role of a manager in helping people just through a few simple questions. So again, just asking a question rather than telling. It's often as simple as that. Shall I ask a question first before I give my view?
Have you seen in your work that the style of communication has changed, possibly from, just the new way that people learn to be entrepreneurs or business owners or managers, and also from the other side, the demands, and I mean, that sounds like a quite aggressive word, but the demands of the workforce now have changed, and people maybe want a different style of being managed?
That's a great question. One thing that I think has changed over the years that I've been doing this is that more tends to be done remotely now, sometimes more reliance on remote communication. And obviously that's come in with more of a hybrid working model that's taken off, as you know, since COVID. So I think in a way, as a manager, you actually perhaps need to be more proactive now in thinking, well, how do we bring people together if they're not all in the office at the same time, if they are working remotely? What can we do? Some organizations just do simple things like maybe one lunchtime a week There might be just a short have your lunch together or meet on Zoom or have days in the office where everybody comes in and there's some kind of team meeting then. So I think there is a need now, with people less likely to be on site, to actually be proactive in bringing people together.
Yeah, absolutely. And out of office communication, where do you stand on that? And when is it appropriate for a manager to contact somebody and expect a response out of hours, or is it never appropriate?
I wouldn't say it's never appropriate because it does depend on the role. However, I think that for the vast majority of roles, it's not appropriate. And, I'm guilty. I look at emails out of hours. I really think as a manager, because one of the important things you need to do as a manager is role model behaviour. So there's a couple of things really. Do you as a manager, as the leader of the group or the company, feel that it's appropriate or not to contact people out of hours? So that's a question you need to ask yourself. And if you think, oh, yes, it is, then you actually think, well, is it really needed? So you might need to dig down. The second thing, if you feel that you would rather people have their time off, and I think that's really important for mental health and for work-life balance and all those things, then you need to be thinking to yourself, am I role modelling this? Because there's one thing of you emailing people out of hours and saying, oh, no, you don't need to reply. But people want to do well, they want to show willing. So you might need to think, what behaviours am I role modelling? Would it be better for me to schedule emails? Or, it doesn't mean that you can't work the longer hours. If it's your company, you probably do. But thinking about the way that you role model. But I think time off is really important. And that is a big change that's happened in recent years. The expectation 20 years ago wasn't, unless you were quite senior in a company, it wasn't that you would be always on call. So I think there's a cultural shift there, which I feel, it's, if you're thinking just purely from the performance and getting the best out of people, as well as the human side, I think it needs a bit of resistance, whether or not it's legally enforced.
Brilliant. Felicity, where can people find out more about you and what you do?
Thank you, Steve. You can visit my website, which is felicitydwyer.com. And if you're interested in Crafting Connection, which has loads of advice on how to connect with yourself, so understanding yourself, because self-awareness is the basis, and also, of course, how to connect with others, how to give feedback, these kinds of things, that's available from all good online bookshops.
You've been thinking about launching a podcast, and it's a great way to promote your business. But where do you start? You have so many questions. What equipment do you need? How long should an episode be? How do you get listed on Spotify? About Basingstoke is the answer. We're professional audio producers with decades of experience. We can advise you on your podcasting strategy, record your episodes, or show you how to do it yourself, get you listed on all the major platforms, and help you understand audience building and ways to turn listeners into leads. Find out more at aboutbasingstoke.com/podcasts. Oh, and if you think you have to do video because who listens to audio these days? Well, you're listening to this, aren't you? Get professional podcast advice and production. Visit aboutbasingstoke.com/podcasts.